Hi, this is the second time of practice English with the Reith Lectures. It was side representations of the intellectual. Okay, so let's start. The first of Bender's Jeremiad against the betrayer of the intellectuals is not the subtlety発音させたい。違う。Subtlety. Subtlety of his argument, nor his quite impossible absolutism when it comes from his totally uncompromising view of the intellectual's mission. Real intellectuals, according to Bender's definition, are supposed to risk being burned at the stake, ostracized, ostracized, or crucified. They are symbolic personage marked by their unyielding distance from practical concerns. As such, therefore, they cannot be many in number, nor routinely developed. They have to be slow-growing individuals with powerful personalities, and above all, they have to be in a state of almost permanent opposition to the status quo. For all these reasons, Bender's intellectuals are inevitably a small, highly visible group of men. He never includes women, whose centurion voices and indelicate implications are hurled at humankind from on high. Bender never suggests how it is that these these men know the truth or whether their blinding insights into eternal principles might, like those of Don Quixote, be little more than private fantasy. Private fantasies. But there is no doubt in my mind, at least, that the imagination of a rare intellectual as generally conceived by Bender remains an attractive and compelling one. Attractive and compelling one.違うのか。Comparing one. Comparing one. Many of his positive as well as negative examples are persuasive. Voltaire's public defense of the Caras family, for instance, or at the upside end, the appalling the appalling nationalism of French writers like Maurice Barres, whom Bender credits with perpetuating a romanticism of harshness and contempt. In the name of French national honor, Bender was spiritually shaped by the Dreyfus Affair and the World War I. Both of them rigorous both of them rigorous tests for intellectuals who could either choose to speak up courageously against an act of anti-Semitic military injustice and nationalist fervor, or sheepishly go along with the herd. Herd. Refusing to defend the unfairly condemned Jewish officer Alfred Dreyfus, chatting jingoist slogans in order to stir up war fever against everything German. After World War II, Bender republished his book, this time adding a series of attacks against intellectuals who collaborated with the Nazis as well as against those who were uncritically enthusiastic about the communities, but deep in the combative rhetoric of Bender's basically very conservative. In the combative rhetoric of Bender's basically very conservative work is to be found this figure of the intellectuals as being set apart. Someone able to speak the truth to power, curiosity, eloquent, fantastically, courageous, and angry, courageous, and angry individual for whom no worldly power is too big and imposing to be criticized and pointedly taken to task. Gramsci's social analysis of the intellectual as a person who fulfills a particular set of function in the society is much closer to reality than anything Bender gives up, particularly in the late 20th century. When so many new professions, broadcasters, academic professionals, computer analysts, sports and media lawyers, management consultants, policy experts, government advisors, authors of specialized market report, and indeed the whole field of modern mass journalism itself have vindicated Gramsci's vision. Today, everyone who works in any field connected either with the production or distribution of knowledge is an intellectual in Gramsci's sense. In most industrialized Western societies, the latter ratio who work in any field connected either with the production or distribution of knowledge is an intellectual in Gramsci's sense. In most industrialized Western societies, the ratio between so-called knowledge industries and those having to do with actual physical production has increased steeply in favor of the knowledge industries. The American sociologist Irving Gardner said several years ago of intellectuals that they were the new class and that intellectual managers had now pretty much replaced the old moneyed and old moneyed 違うな。The old moneyed old moneyed and propertied classes. Yet Gardner Yet Gardner also said Gardner also said that as part of their ascendancy, intellectuals were no longer people who addressed a wide public. Instead, they had become members of what he called a culture of critical discourage. Each intellectual, the book editor and the author, the military stagist, and the international lawyer speaks and deals in a language that has become specialized and usable by other members of the same field. Specialized experts addressing other specialized experts in lingua franca. Largely unintelligible to unspecialized people. Similarly, the French philosopher Michel Foucault has said that the so-called universal intellectual, he probably had Jean-Paul Sartre in mind, has had his or her place taken by the specific intellectual, someone who works inside a discipline, but who is able to use his expertise anyway. Here, Foucault was thinking specifically of American physicist Robert Oppenheimer, who moved outside his specialist field when he was an organizer of the Los Alamos atomic bomb project in 1942-1945, and later became a sort of commissioner of scientific affairs in the US. And the proliferation of intellectuals has extended even into the very large number of fields in which intellectuals, possibly following on Gramsci's pioneering suggestion in the prison notebooks, which almost for the first time saw intellectuals and not social classes as pivotal pivotal to the workings.
Pivotal.
Pivotal.
Pivotal. Pivotal.
As pivotal to the workings of modern society, have become the object of study. Just put the words of and next to the word intellectuals, and almost immediately entire library of studies about intellectuals that is quite daunting in its range of military daunting and daunting in its range and military
Minutely.
range and minutely focused minutelyなんでやねん
minutely
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 minutely minutely minutely minutely
minutely
minutely yeah はい focused in its detail focused in its detail rises before our eyes. There are thousands of different histories and sociologies of intellectuals available, as well as endless accounts of intellectuals and nationalism. Intellectuals and nationalism, and power and tradition and revolution, and on and on. Each region of the world has produced its intellectuals, and each of those formations is debated and argued over with fiery passion. Fiery passion. There has been no major revolution in modern history without intellectuals. Conversely, there has been no major counter-revolutionary movement without intellectuals. Intellectuals have been the fathers and mothers of movement, and of course sons and daughters, even nephews and nieces. nices. Before the age of the mass media, but he sensed how important it was for governments to have as their servants. Yeah. よし、ここから Let's start. Propaganda. Real intellectuals are supposed to risk in ground of the states, ostracized or crucified. They are symbolic personages marked by their unyielding distance from practical concerns. As such, therefore, they cannot be many in number, nor routinely developed. They have to be struggling individuals with powerful personalities, and above all, they have to be in a state of almost permanent opposition to the status quo. For these reasons, Benda's intellectuals are inevitably a small, highly visible group of men. He never includes women, whose centurion voices and indelicate implications are hurled at humankind. Benda never suggests how it is that these men know the truth, or whether their blinding insights into eternal principles might, like those of Don Quixote, be little more than private fantasies. But there's no doubt in my mind, at least, that the image of real intellectual, and generally conceived by Benda, remains an attractive and compelling one. Many of his positive as well as negative examples are possessive. Voltaire's public Defenses of Carol's family, for instance, were at the upside end. The appearing nationalism of French writers like Maurice Barres like those of Don Quixote be little more than private fantasies. But there is no doubt in my mind, at least, that the image of rare intellectual, as generally conceived by Bender, remain an attractive and compelling one. Bender was. Bender was spiritually shaped by the Griffith affair and World War I. Both of them rigorous tests for intellectuals who could either choose to speak up courageously against an act of anti-Semitic military injustice and nationalist fervor. The Rifles Affair and World War I, both of the rigorous tests for intellectuals who could either choose to speak up courageously against an act of anti-Semitic military injustice and nationalist fervor, or sheepishly go along with the herd, refusing to defend the unfairly condemned Jewish officer, Alfred Dreyfus, chanting jingoist slogans in order to stir up war fever against everything German. After World War II, Bender republished his book, this time adding a series of attacks against intellectuals who collaborated with the Nazi, as well as against those who were uncritically enthusiastic about the communists. But deep in the combative rhetoric of Bender's basically very conservative work is to be found this figure of intellectuals as a being set apart, someone able to speak the truth to power, eloquent, fantastically courageous and angry individuals for whom no worldly power is too big and imposing to be criticized and pointedly taken to task. Gramsci's social analysis of the intellectuals as a person who fulfill a particular set of functions in the society is much closer to the reality than anything Bender gives us. particularly in the late 20th century, when so many new professions, broadcasters, academic professors, computer analysts, sports and media lawyers, management consultants, policy experts, government advisors, author of specialized market reports, and indeed the whole field of modern mass journalism itself. All these have indicated Gramsci's vision. Today, everyone who works in any field connected either with the production or distribution of knowledge is an intellectual in Gramsci's sense. In most industrialized Western societies, the ratio between so-called knowledge industries and those having to do with actual physical production has increased steeply in favor of the knowledge industries. Knowledge. And that intellectual managers had now pretty much replaced the old moneyed and propertied classes. Yet Gurner also said that as part of their ascendancy, intellectuals were no longer people who addressed a wide public. Instead, they had become members of what he called a culture of critical discourse. Each intellectual, the book editor and the author, the military strategist, and the international lawyer, speaks and deals in a language that has become specialized and usable by other members of the same field. Specialized experts addressing other specialized experts in a lingua franca, largely unintelligible to unspecialized people. And the prisoner of culture, an extended, even very large number of intellectuals, possibly following a Gramsci's pioneerist suggestion in prison note. And the proliferation of intellectuals has extended even into the very large number of fields in which intellectuals, possibly following on Gramsci's pioneering suggestion in the prison notebook, which almost for the first time saw intellectuals and not social classes as pivotal to the working of modern society. Intellectuals become the objective study. Just put the words of and next to the word intellectuals, and almost immediately an entire library of studies about intellectuals that is quite daunting in its range and minutely focused in its detail rises before our eyes. There are thousands of different histories and sociologies of intellectuals available, as well as endless account of intellectuals and nationalism and power and tradition and revolution and on and on. Each region of the world has produced its intellectuals, and each of those formations is debated and argued over with fiery passion. There has been no major revolution in the modern history without intellectuals. Conversely, there has been no major counter-revolutionary movement without intellectuals. Intellectuals have been the fathers and mothers of movement, and of course, sons and daughters, even nephews and nieces. Speed を上げてもう一度。For Benda, rare intellectuals are supposed to risk in the random state, ostracized, or crucified. They are symbolic personages marked by their unyielding distance from practical concerns. As such, therefore, they cannot be many in number, nor routinely developed. They have to be thoroughgoing individuals with powerful personalities, and above all, they have to be in the state of almost permanent opposition to the stage core. For all these reasons, Benda's intellectuals are inevitably a small, highly visible group of men. He never includes women. Or herded a humankind from on high. Benda never suggests how it is that these men know the truth, or whether their blinding insights into eternal principles might, like those of Don Quixote, be little more than private fantasies. But there is no doubt in my mind, at least, that the image of rare intellectual as generally conceived by Benda remains an attractive and compelling one. Many of his positive as well. Both of them rigorous tests for intellectuals who could either choose to speak up courageously against an act of anti-Semitic military injustice and nationalist fervor, or sheepishly go along with the herd, refusing to defend a unfairly condemned Jewish officer, or fled the rapist, chatting jingoist slogans in order to stir up war fervor against it. After World War II, Benda republished his book, this time adding a series of attacks against intellectuals who collaborated with the Nazis, as well as against those who were critically enthusiastic, but basically conservative work is to be found figure of the intellectuals as being set apart. Some are able to speak the truth to power, across eloquent, fantastically courageous, and angry individuals for whom no worldly power is too big and imposing to be criticized and potentially taken to task. Gramsci's social analyst of the intellectuals as a person who fulfills a particular set of functions. particularly in the late 20th century, when so many new professions, broadcast, academic, professional analysts, sport and media lawyers, management consultants, policy experts, government advisors, authors of specialized market reports, and indeed the whole field of modern math journalism itself. All these have vindicated Gramsci's vision. Today, everyone who works in any field connected either with the production or distribution of knowledge is an intellectual in Gramsci's sense. In most individualized Western societies, the ratio between so-called knowledge industries and those having to do with actual physical production has increased steeply in favor of the knowledge industry. The American sociologist Irving Gardner said several years ago of intellectuals that they were the new class, and that intellectual managers have now pretty much replaced the older moneyed and propertied classes. Yet Gardner also said that a part of this tendency, intellectuals were no longer people who addressed the wide public. Instead, they had become members of what he called a culture of critical discourse. Each intellectual, the book editor and the author, the military strategist, and the international lawyer, speaks and deals in a language that has become specialized and usable by other members of the same field. Specialized experts addressing other specialized experts in a lingua franca largely unintelligible to unspecialized people. Where is the notebook? As pivotal to the working of modern society, intellectuals become the object of study. Just put the words of and next to the word intellectuals, and almost immediately an entire library of studies about intellectuals that is quite daunting in its range and military focused in its detail rises above our eyes. There are thousands of different histories and sociologies. Each region of the world has produced in its intellectuals, and each these formations is debated and argued over with a fiery passion. There has been no major revolution in the modern history without intellectuals. Conversely, there has been no major counter-revolutionary movement without intellectuals. Intellectuals have been the fathers and the mothers of movements, and of course, sons of daughters, even nephews and nieces. 疲れた。Just end. See you next time.